This is really, I hope, in the tradition that Governor Ray established here when he was governor, because it's an effort to lay out for people what we need to do in a way that we can all understand it as citizens and we can put it together. And I'm particularly glad that Greg was willing to come and introduce me. I'm delighted that he's supporting me. He's a dear friend. But I didn't realize till last night when we were at his house that he had kept this. The original contract was a TV Guide ad. It tells you how long ago it was. They had a thing called TV Guide. This was back in the early days when there were relatively few, before cable. And the original ad I took, and every time we'd pass something, I'd go and I would to the floor and I'd use a hole punch and click it, and that copy's now in the Smithsonian. But there's something interesting I want to share with you. The only person who's actually understood this that has written about it was Chuck Schumer, the Democratic senator from New York, who in a book a couple years ago pointed out that the real purpose of the contract was a management document for the Republican Party. That while it had a powerful political impact, as Greg just pointed out to you, we voted on all these things in 93 days. It enabled us to say to our team, glad you got here, you already gave your word, here's what we're doing. Now, it was a hugely successful political document, which most of the media has never focused on. The largest one-party increase in American history is 1994. We gained 9 million votes over 1990. The Democrats only lose 1 million votes. The real swing is people who turn out who've never voted before. And the reason's simple. There's no attack here. When you see the ad in TV Guide, we don't attack Bill Clinton. There's nothing pretty about it. We were serious. This was an adult document for adults. We thought citizens were concerned enough about the country, you could treat them as adults. And people liked that. They liked the idea that maybe politics is about hiring somebody to get a job done. It's not about who has the best 30-second attack ad or who has the most clever consultant. But it's about what do you really think we need to do and how do we do it. Now, I've been at this since August of 1958. My dad was a career soldier, spent 27 years in the infantry. We were in France when the French Fourth Republic was killed by the paratroopers and de Gaulle was brought back and invented the Fifth Republic. It was very sobering to a young kid born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And it really hit me that countries can die without adequate leadership. So between my freshman and sophomore years in high school, I began studying 3 things, which I've studied ever since. What does America need to do to be successful? How would you explain it with sufficient clarity that the American people will give you permission to do it? And how would you implement it if they gave you permission? I did this working with Ronald Reagan, did this working as Speaker of the House, and I did this as a volunteer advisor to the Bush administration. I believe, and I'm going to test this with all of you, I believe we're in real trouble. And I think it's very broad-based trouble. It's not just any one thing. But let me ask you, how many of you agree that America is on the wrong track? Just raise your hand if you agree. Virtually unanimous. How many of you agree that getting back on the right track will be an enormous effort? That's one last thing. How many of you agree that very substantial interest groups will fight deeply against getting back on the right track? Now, I just want to feed back to you what you've just said, because this is the heart of why I'm proposing a 21st century contract with America. Our challenges are enormous. I think the biggest since 1860. The difficulty of changing direction for an enormous national government, an enormous national elite, whether it's the courts, the news media, the academic world, the bureaucracies, the laws, are going to be tremendous. And there will be people who legitimately, authentically fight desperately to stop us. Because whether out of interest group or out of ideology, they don't agree. And so if you're serious about saving the country and you're serious about moving forward, you've got to start with that design. You've got to say, this is what we're trying to accomplish. I mean, it's a little bit like, are you trying to develop a canoe for a local creek, or are you trying to build a ship to cross the Pacific? You better decide in advance what size do you need. This contract is designed in a much deeper way. Now, there are 4 parts to the proposed contract. This is the one I'm talking about today in detail, but the 4 parts give you a sense of scale. The first, which I'm going to deal with today, is the legislative part. What should we pass as law? The second, which we're beginning to unveil, and you can see at newt.org, is called On the First Day. Imagine that shortly after delivering the inaugural address, we take an hour, and for 1 hour, I sign between 50 and 200 executive orders, fundamentally shifting the direction of the United States government before 5 o'clock on the first day. All of them within the law. That's why you have to have this stuff to change the law. But for example, the very first executive order we know for sure, it would abolish all the White House czars as of that moment. Now you can go through a series of these things and begin to have a sense of scale. That there's a lot you can do pretty fast. Reagan, for example, signs an executive order which eliminates rationing gasoline and liberates gasoline, and within 6 months the price has collapsed. So there are things you can do that are decisive. Third, we're going to need a training program for the transition team and a training program for all presidential appointees. Because if you want change on this scale, there's no reason to believe normal traditional appointees have a clue what they're doing. They can go in and run the old order and the old system. They don't know how to run this new system. And finally, and this is something I say to every audience, we need a citizen-centered model that uses social media. Because I don't ask anybody to be for me. If you're for me, you vote, you go home, and you say, I sure hope he fixes it. I ask people to be with me. Because for 8 years, we need to work together. We need to work together in reminding the Congress what we're trying to get done. We need to work together in making sure that as things don't work, and if you have this scale change, some things won't work. And so you have to have a real-time feedback loop of people who send you an email or get on a conference call or participate in a video conference and say, you know, that I know you meant well, that ain't working. Because you're going to have constant evolution and constant change in order to actually implement what you're talking about. You can set a general direction and be pretty stable, but you can't implement in a stable way because things change, and you got to have modifications. You have to be part of that active feedback. There's another reason. If we implement the 10th Amendment and we return power to the states and the citizens, as you shrink the Washington bureaucrats, you have to grow the citizens. I mean, you're asking us to turn power back home, fine. That means you're going to actually have more responsibility. And so the fourth part of this is how do we build a genuine citizens movement that really is prepared to take responsibility for our country? I think the change is so enormous that I went back and this is the one thing I want to read to you today. This is a message Abraham Lincoln sends to the Congress in December of 1862. The Civil War is not going well. It is clearly totally different than he expected, much harder. And he writes to Congress, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. I think the reason Washington is a total mess is that nobody in Washington is prepared today to disenthrall themselves and take the risk of thinking new. So let me briefly just walk you through this. I'm not going to go in great detail. If you want to, there's a 23-page version of this at newt.org, because this is a serious management document. This will evolve. This is not the final document. The two big differences between this contract and 1994. The first is the scale of change I am suggesting is so enormous that I couldn't possibly, as a single leader, show you everything I'm going to do. So this is the beginning of a conversation, which by September 27th next year, the anniversary of the contract, we will have a final version of. But this shows you the direction we're going in. And it shows you what you could participate in if you want to help design it. The second difference is, in 1994, we stood on Ronald Reagan's shoulders. We've been talking about welfare reform since he first ran for governor in 1966. So we could say, here's the bill. There were 780 pages of legislation behind the contract. This little device here had 780 pages of legislation. And Congressman Dick Armey and others did a great job putting that together. We don't have the advantage of 30 years of Reaganism. Some of the things I'm about to describe to you, we don't know how to do yet. And so they will take about a year to pass all this because we need to use regular order. We've had in this current administration a stimulus package no member had read. We had an Obamacare so complex that Speaker Pelosi said you have to pass it to learn what's in it. That's wrong. So while I'm going to propose these, I'm going to fight with these, I'm going to ask you to join me in passing them. They should come through a regular legislative process where subcommittees hold hearings, they hold markups, they report to the full committee, they hold markups, they go to the floor, and they have a chance to amend it. So the will of the American people is actually expressed the way the Constitution suggested. That's a much harder process. It isn't ramming things through, it's legislating. It's trying to actually bring to bear the intelligence of the American people to solve our problems. There are 10 areas we need to do it in. The first is we need to repeal Obamacare, and we need to develop a common sense replacement for it. I helped found the Center for Health Transformation. We've had years of putting together ideas. You can see them at healthtransformation.net. There are all sorts of ideas in the paper at newt.org. This is doable, and the reason you have to repeal it is it's a 2,700-page document. You can't repeal part of it because, candidly, you can't trust the staffs to tell you which part you ought to repeal. Now, there are about 300 pages that are pretty good, about a little over 10%. But they should be part of the replaced document. You shouldn't get involved. Just repeal this immediately. This you could do pretty fast. But it's going to take a couple months to actually pass the replacement. Second, we've got to create jobs. The Reagan recovery was so dramatic that in this month, September 1983, third year of the Reagan presidency, and he inherited a bad economy from Carter, just as Obama inherited a bad economy from Bush. The fact is, Reagan didn't think leadership's job was to complain. He thought that the leadership's job was to solve. The result was, this month in 1983, the American people created 1,100,000 new jobs. Compare that to 0 new jobs in August. There's a difference. Reagan had a 4-part plan. Cut taxes, cut regulations, develop American energy, praise the people who take risks and create jobs. So the opposite of class warfare. A policy of saying, I'm glad you're going out to invest. I'm glad you're going out to start a company. I'm glad you show up every Monday and run your small business. Fundamentally different attitude. When I became Speaker, we followed the Reagan model. First tax cut in 16 years, largest capital gain tax cut in history. Reform welfare. 2 out of 3 people went back to work or went to school. Cut regulations. Guess what happened? In the 4 years I was Speaker, the American people noticed. I didn't say I created. I've actually run 4 small businesses. I have created a few jobs, but I did that as a business leader, not as a politician. The American people created 11 million new jobs during the period I was Speaker. I remind my good friends that's more jobs in Utah than under Governor Huntsman. It is more jobs in Massachusetts than under Governor Romney. And in 4 years, the American people created more jobs in Texas than in 11 years under Governor Perry. Now, I'm not drawing invidious comparisons, but I am suggesting that if I talk about how to create jobs, there may be something to it. First of all, taxes. We ought to have an optional flat tax. So if you want to keep the current code, you want to keep the current mortgage deduction, you want to keep all that stuff, fine. But if you'd like a 1-page alternative, it can be developed on a revenue-neutral basis. It's been experimented with in Rhode Island. It's been used in Europe. It gives you a choice. And you'll hear me talk a lot about your choices today. Second, 0 capital gains tax rate, so hundreds of billions of dollars pour in to develop America. 12.5% corporate tax rate, so that we liberate the $1.2 trillion overseas that is currently locked up in profits that won't come home. And ironically, for my liberal friends, I remind them, at 12.5%, we'll actually get General Electric to pay taxes because it'll be cheaper to pay taxes than to hire lawyers to avoid taxes. 100% expensing for all new equipment, including farm equipment, factory equipment, office equipment. So with a specific goal, we want Americans to be the best equipped, most productive workers on the planet so we can compete with China and win. Finally, we abolish the death tax permanently. We want businesses that are successful focused on job creation, not focused on tax avoidance. That's a tax policy. Deregulation. Repeal Dodd-Frank immediately. and I would try to get that done in the first 2 or 3 weeks. It is a disastrous bill. It is 2,300 pages, which does to financial services what Obamacare does to health. And the fact is that it is killing small banks, it is killing small business, it is crippling housing, and it's creating a center of corruption at the Treasury, micromanaging the large banks. It is a terrible bill. Second, repeal Sarbanes-Oxley, a bill which raises the cost of doing business in America without producing any new information that's useful. Third, replace the Environmental Protection Agency with a brand new Environmental Solutions Agency that focuses on economic rationality, on cooperation with communities back home, and on modern science, and frankly on common sense. I mean, the best example is right here in Iowa. Somebody in Washington who had never been on a farm has written a regulation involving dust. Part of the regulation suggests that dirt roads should not create dust. Just look at what Senator Grassley has been saying recently. You can't imagine an agency this out of touch with reality. And I don't think it's fixable, which is why I say replace. And finally, as an example, I would replace the current FDA with the 21st Century Food and Drug Administration, whose specific job is to be in the laboratory learning the science and accelerate getting new knowledge to the patient, not hinder it. Fundamentally the opposite of the current FDA. And the reason is simple. If you want to create jobs, health is the largest section of the economy in the world. As people get wealthier, they want to live longer and live better. If the U.S. has an FDA which encourages the development of new solutions, we will dominate the world health market. If we dominate the world health market, those are very high value jobs that pay very well and produce a lot of capital for the United States. And it's the most logical area if you're trying to build a high employment, high income economy. We need to unleash America's full energy production potential. Very simple. We have more total energy, whether you want to talk ethanol or oil and gas or coal or nuclear power or solar or wind. We have more total energy than any other country in the world. More than Russia, more than Canada, more than Saudi Arabia. And we have a government which is anti-American energy. Energy jobs pay pretty high salaries. In western Pennsylvania, developing natural gas in the Marcellus Shale is about a $72,000 a year job. Off of Louisiana, it's about an $80,000 a year job developing oil and gas in the Gulf. These are good jobs, but the government which hates them. I like them. So one of my first goals would be to create American energy that keeps $400 billion a year at home. I'd rather have it go to Iowa than Iraq. I'd rather have it go to South Dakota than Saudi Arabia. I'm very comfortable saying to the American people, let's develop our own energy. And by the way, I'm for more revenue. I'm just against higher taxes. If you develop American energy, government revenue goes up dramatically because the government gets royalties. Give you an example of how much potential revenues you've got. You, the American people, we own 69% of Alaska. I reminded Governor Perry the other day, didn't want to offend him, Alaska is twice the size of Texas. If we own 69% of Alaska, that's 1.5 Texases. So you can bring the environmentalist in and say, look, we're going to give you half of Texas. Pick the 125,000 square miles you would like to develop, you'd like to keep as parks, wilderness areas. Terrific. That means we get to develop 250,000 square miles, an area the size of Texas. Can you imagine the net value in American jobs and in revenue to the federal government? So you get more revenue out of people going to work and lower costs because they're no longer on Medicaid, no longer on food stamps, no longer on welfare and unemployment. And you get more revenue out of energy production, and you get more revenue out of federal lands. All of those increase revenue flow with no tax increase. Fourth, you have to save Medicare and Social Security. I spent years on this project. I chaired the Medicare Reform Task Force of 1996. We saved it for over a decade. I've been involved at the Center for Health Transformation. It requires new thinking in the Lincoln tradition. On Social Security, it's simple. Every young American should have the right to choose whether or not they want a personal Social Security account on the Chilean model. And here I agree with Herman Cain. He's got it down exactly right. It's a very simple model. You don't have to make it compulsory. I am against making things compulsory if you can avoid it. You go to young people and you say to them, would you rather have, and you show them the 2 clips of Obama in August saying, I may not be able to pay your Social Security check. Remember that? So you say, do you want to spend 70, 50, or 60 years of your life working knowing that politicians may at some morning not give you the money? Or would you like to have your own account that you control? Would you like a system that has no estate buildup, or would you like to have a system where it's your money? Would you like to have a system where the politicians are going to tell you they got to raise the working age, or would you like to have a system where there's no required retirement age? If it's your personal account, you retire when you feel like you want to retire. Why should the government tell you when to retire? By the way, 1,200,000 people over 75 still work. So if you don't want to retire, why should the government tell you you have to retire? I mean, this is all a 1935 model for an industrial era society which is gone. Now, you say to everybody who currently is in the system, fine, relax. We're not going to change it. If you get the kind of economic growth that these two create, Social Security is fine for the next 30 years. And if 30 years is a long enough transition period, you're going to have probably 80 to 90% of the population in the new model. And they literally, over their lifetime, get out of compound interest 2.5 to 3 times as much money as they're going to get out of the current system. On Medicare, very simple. You start with something that we published a book on called Stop Paying the Crooks. Now, you would have thought Stop Paying the Crooks was clear enough that even in Washington, it would have led to serious conversation. Didn't have any impact. The Center for Health Transformation published it 3 years ago. I was very confident it would break through. No impact at all. Here are the numbers, just so you understand what we're talking about. If you have an American Express card, they use massive expert systems to track fraud. So does Visa, so does MasterCard. How many of you have ever had a call to double check and make sure you had actually made the charge, right? Okay. So this is, I'm not, just for the purpose of people in Washington, I am not making this up. Do you agree? It is literally true. American Express pays 0.03 of 1% to crooks. New York State Medicaid, according to the New York Times, pays over 10%. That means, as a taxpayer, you're paying 330 times as much to crooks, 33,000% more than you would pay as an American Express cardholder. Now that's a level of government incompetence that's staggering. So the first place you save Medicare and Medicaid is you stop paying the crooks. It's between $70 and $120 billion a year. So you hear all about this super committee. Stop paying the crooks gets you between half and 2/3 of their goal without affecting anybody who's honest. But it requires thinking. It requires new approaches. I've talked to American Express, Visa, and MasterCard. All three are ready to go into the Congress and explain it. They'd all three go to Health and Human Services and explain it. The head of IBM did go to see the president and explained it. Didn't work. This is why Lincoln talked about new thinking, disenthralling yourself of the past. You have a paper-based bureaucracy trying to keep up with crooks who have iPads. It is impossible. Second, you give people a choice. We're now having people say we may have to means test Medicare. Why don't you just pass Tom Price's law, Congressman Dr. Tom Price's law, that says if you're successful and you'd like to contract out, you're allowed to contract out. If you want to go and pay more to the doctor or hospital, you can go pay more to them. I mean, every liberal will tell you that's impossible. So Medicare today is more restrictive than the British National Health Service. Why not allow people who are successful to have a choice? And you could institute next year Paul Ryan's model of support, for purchase support, but make it voluntary. And say to people, if you'd like to, and then you say to the insurance industry and others, you want to compete for the customers, fine. You don't have to, you can then say to everybody who wants to stay in the old order, fine. Stay in the old system, but we're going to give you more and more opportunities to have better and better choices. You know, we don't compel people to go to Walmart. You know, you're going to hear some folks say to you, oh, senior citizens get too confused. You can't allow them to have this many choices. Well, Calista and I take her mother occasionally to Walmart in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. The idea of walking through and saying to her, you know, there are 258,000 items at a Walmart. Maybe you don't want to go to all the aisles. She'd think I was crazy. But the right to choose is different than being forced. So there are ways to modernize Social Security and Medicare that will save money, control the system, and in the long run give people better options. You want to control balance the federal budget, and here I want to recognize Mike George is here, who is a terrific. Stand for take a bow. Mike George. Mike George is an example of why America is a unique country. He helped develop a system called Lean Six Sigma. His first client was Boeing back in 1981. He did pretty darn well. He made enough money. Then he decided to take his own money voluntarily to organize Strong America Now, whose premise is if you modernize the federal government, you can save $500 billion a year. Now, I want to make clear about this. This is not minor, let's go out and find waste. In order to apply modern management to the federal government, you end the 130-year-old tradition of the civil service system, and you end the regulatory mess that we're in today, and you actually can move every day with continuous improvement, which is the heart of being able to get to a quality system. This is a big, not a small idea. And I'm the only Speaker of the House in your lifetime who balanced the federal budget. We did it for 4 straight years. We paid off $405 billion in debt. So I'm here as a personal expert testimony to my own candidate, saying to you, I know we can do this. And then we should pass a balanced budget amendment so future generations are reminded, don't say yes to every interest group that shows up. Sixth, we need to control the border by January 1, 2014. This is not hard. I just want to say, to anybody who thinks this is hard, I've written 2 novels about World War II. I used to teach about World War II. From December 7, 1941 to victory over Japan in August 1945 is 44 months. In 3 years and 8 months, we defeat Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. It recently took 23 years to add a 5th runway to the Atlanta airport. Now, being determined to build a system that is stupid is permissible if you're really rich and nobody threatens you. But as you begin to have real competitors and you begin to have real problems, it is useful to apply common sense. I've said, for example, there are 23,000 Department of Homeland Security personnel in the Washington area. If necessary to achieve this goal, I would be willing to move half of them to Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona so that they could serve on the border. That would about double the people available. But this idea that you can't control your border is nonsense. Every country in history that wants to does it. It's a matter of willpower. And so you'd want to pass a bill early in 2013 that says, we're waiving every impediment to getting the border controlled, go do it. And you do it. Now, that doesn't solve all the problems. That's just the beginning of a process. And we need to deal with the whole issue of appropriate immigration. I think we need to modernize the legal visa system. Our current visa system is a total mess. It's actually more expensive to get a legal visa than it is to sneak into the country. That strikes me as backwards. So, there are a lot of things we have to do there, and we covered at newt.org in the longer version. Seventh, we need a serious national conversation about national security. We are in vastly greater danger than anybody wants to talk about. And part of that danger is the rise of modern weapons. Part of that danger is terrorist groups who hate us. Part of that danger is the rise of China. Part of that danger is international crime on a scale that we're not prepared today to cope with, and which manifests itself, for example, in Mexico. But this conversation, it's tragic and it's dangerous that our elites are exhausted, our news media is timid, and the result is we're not having a serious discussion about national security. And in some ways it manifests itself in things like Admiral Mullins, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who just now has said he's come to the conclusion Pakistan's not our ally. Well, it's a very bold thing to say in Washington. It's a very obvious thing to say if you're anywhere else in the world. I mean, if bin Laden was living for 5 years in a building a mile from their National Defense University in the middle of a military city, do you think that was physically possible without large elements of the Pakistani government knowing it? Of course not. And this proposal that we keep 3,000 troops in Iraq is, I think, very frightening. 3,000 troops is too small to defend itself and should be thought of as a target. And this administration is making political decisions that risk the lives of young men and women in uniform, and it is profoundly wrong. My dad, as I said earlier, served 27 years in the Army. I know what military family life is like, and it is wrong to put Americans at risk for political reasons and leaving only 3,000 troops. We either ought to leave enough troops to defend themselves or get them all out. But you leave a small group in a dangerous neighborhood and somebody's going to come and try to kill them. And it is a very dangerous thing to do. And we badly need, I wish we could have at least 2 or 3 debates only on national security. And I'll be making a series of speeches outlining that more later on. 8th, this is probably one of the 2 boldest parts of the contract. I'm going to paint a word picture. Imagine a projected cost between now and 2050 of $20 trillion. That's 1.5 federal debts. If I said, I have an area that's $20 trillion, maybe we should focus on it. In Washington, this would be a radical and even weird idea. That's what Alzheimer's is projected to do. Now add to Alzheimer's Parkinson's, autism, mental health. All of them have one common zone. They all involve brain science. Brain science will be the most rapidly accelerating knowledge area in the world in the next quarter century. Experts in Alzheimer's say if you could simply postpone it, not cure it, postpone it for 5 years, because it's largely a disease of aging, you save about half the money. So somewhere between $6 and $10 trillion. You'd say to yourself, as practical people, if I could save $6 to $10 trillion, what would I invest? I mean, for people who, for example, change the oil in their car before the engine stops, this is not an irrational concept. In Washington, it's weird. This is a conversation I've been, Bob Carey of Nebraska and I co-chaired for 3 years an Alzheimer's working group, and I've tried to get politicians to slow down and understand. At a human level, Alzheimer's is the most feared disease of people over 55. At a personal family level, people who are caregivers for Alzheimer patients have twice the health problems of people who aren't. At a financial level, it is 1.5 federal debts. And so I'm going to propose very dramatic, and this will be a speech in the near future, I'd like to actually give it at the University of Iowa, on the scale of change we need to fundamentally rethink how we exploit brain science across the board. How do we help autism? How do we help Alzheimer's? How do we help Parkinson's? How do we help mental health? The net payback will be several times the national debt over the next generation. And the potential from that to have an export industry helping the entire planet deal with these problems will create an incalculable number of new American jobs. It's one of the 2 boldest areas in the contract. The 9th one is the other one. There is no judicial supremacy. This is an artifact of the Warren Court in 1958. In the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton says, the judiciary is the weakest of the 3 branches and will inevitably lose in a fight with the 2 elected branches, the legislative and the executive. In the Judicial Reform Act of 1802, Thomas Jefferson, whose Secretary of State was James Madison, so you have to assume the 2 of them knew something about the Constitution. They abolish 18 out of 35 federal judges. They say, go away. You don't have a job anymore. Several of them tried to file a lawsuit claiming that it was unconstitutional, and the judges they went to said to them, are you crazy? If we agree to hear the lawsuit, they'll abolish our office. It's a huge fight. People forget. In the Declaration of Independence, look at it sometime and look at the number of citations of British judges. The second most popular complaint of the American people after no taxation without representation was imperial British judges acting as dictators. Now, when you have a judge who in San Antonio on June 1st issued a ruling that not only could students not pray at a high school graduation, they could not use the word prayer, they could not use the word God, they could not use the word benediction, they could not ask the audience to stand, and he would arrest the superintendent if any student broke his order. That judge is about as anti-American as you can get. This is a country founded by a document which says we are endowed by our Creator. I'm against state religions. Let me be clear about this. This is not about theology. But this is about an unending effort to fundamentally change America. This is about judges who now cite the Zimbabwe court and other foreign courts. I mean, And we're going to have a very big fight over the proper role of the judicial branch, because the idea that appointed lifetime lawyers get to dictate the future of America is crazy. Jefferson was asked about it at one point and said that would be an oligarchy. Lincoln, in his first inaugural, speaking of the Dred Scott decision, which would have extended slavery to the whole country, said if 9 appointed people can define the Constitution of the United States to the exclusion of the legislative and executive branch, we have ceased to be a free country. And this is a topic that deserves serious, fundamental conversation as a country. Finally, we need to enforce the 10th Amendment. It's very simple. Washington's too big. Washington's too powerful. We are citizens, not subjects. Washington is supposed to serve us. We're not supposed to serve Washington. And the only way to fundamentally change that is to go step by step and take everything we can back home, which, as I said earlier, means as you shrink the Washington bureaucrats, you have got to grow the citizens. So this is a fairly decisive first step. We're going to flesh it all out between now and September 27th of next year. We want your help to do it. You can see all of it at newt.org. There'll be lots and lots of people who anybody who wants to can participate for the next year. But I think it's going to take the nation. The only way you're going to save this country is for the American people to save it. No single president, no set of politicians, no magic. Just hard work, common sense, and a willingness to put the country first.